Hello there, this is Josh Burtram, and we have another episode of the Faith Roundtable coming your way where we talk to thinkers and leaders, theologians and authors about issues that are pertinent and at the top of the list for the church in America today. And on this episode, I have the distinct privilege to interview Sarah E. Westfall. She is a writer, speaker, and host of the Human Together podcast. Her previous work includes serving as director of community for online writing groups, and as a student development professional on college campuses. She's been published in Relevant Magazine, Fathom Magazine, and Encourage. Sarah lives in Indiana with her husband, Ben, and 4 sons. Sarah, it is great to have you on the program today to talk about your new book, The Way of Belonging, through IVP Press. Thanks for being on.
Oh, it's a joy to be with you, Josh. I'm grateful for the invitation.
Absolutely. And so you have 4 sons. You know, I grew up in a family of 5, and I'm one of 4 boys. And then we have a sister that's at the top of the list there as the oldest. And so I imagine that your life is fairly busy with 4 sons.
It is quite active and loud. My goodness. Just
I'm sure it's
the
very,
volume
very loud
on any given day.
I can only imagine, and the fights and the wrestling. Have you had any holes in the walls?
Multiple.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, I have 2 girls and 1 boy. I have 3, and my son is the oldest, and then I have 2 younger daughters, and it's amazing how they can be still very loud, but they're not nearly as destructive, although they are very messy. I will say they are very, very messy, but they are not nearly as destructive as I was and my brothers were growing up. So I totally can feel your pain with that one.
Yeah.
So I gotta ask, with the I had that bio that I was able to read about you from the website, but what did that bio miss? Kind of tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you've gotten to this place in your life.
Yeah. Well, we live in the Midwest, and I kind of was born and raised here, but my husband and I, we've been married. It'll be 20 years in just a couple weeks here.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. It's kind of wild. It feels like we aren't old enough for this. We're still trying to figure out how to be adults. But so we've been married almost 20 years. First 13 years of our marriage, we moved 11 times. Most of that was due to job related things. I worked on college campuses. We lived on college campuses, so that kept us fairly mobile. And then we also had an affinity for flipping houses. And so we moved, stayed like in the same city, but moved different houses here a little bit here and there. So that also, I think, had a profound effect on belonging and my understanding of belonging, being a little bit transient in that way.
Yeah.
But I've always kind of straddled in my career both the writing and the publishing world, and then what I call like peopling. So doing work that is really focused on creating and supporting community and individuals within that community, both on college campuses and then in some online creative spaces as well. And I have I've always kind of gone back and forth between those. And I really feel like both of those are a part of me. Sometimes one is more at the forefront than the other, but I've always found that they hold hands, and it's kind of essential to who I am and to how my work continues to move forward in the world.
That's really, really cool. And so, what actually inspired the writing of this book about the way of belonging? What led you? I know you kind of had some experience, what you're saying, with trying to figure out when you're moving how to belong, but what was it that was the catalyst for writing this particular book?
Yeah. Belonging is a question that I have carried just since I was probably in elementary school. As I began to kind of wrestle with questions of who am I? Where do I fit? And wrestling with acceptance within certain circles and kind of figuring out who I am and how I want to be in the world. And so it's always been somewhat of a question. We had a really, but kind of paired with that is that I also have been a little bit, I'm a firstborn achiever, pretty independent person. And so I have never been, I always kind of let my belonging be defined a little bit more by recognition and a pat on the back
Mm.
than I have by actually being known and seen and enjoyed for who I really am. And so with that, in that kind of mode of trying to gain acceptance, to gain belonging through changing who I was or kind of morphing into certain circles and getting that recognition, really kind of came crashing down in my mid 20s. I and found out midway through that pregnancy that he was not going to survive after birth.
Mm.
Um, and so I found myself just overwhelmed, overcome by grief, both in that diagnosis and the weeks that followed, and then in the year after he was born.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I lost all sense of independence. I could do very little
Mm.
for myself. We still had a toddler son. Our oldest was about, 16 months at the time. I just require I needed a lot of help. I needed, it was hard to get out of bed in the morning, let alone make meals or take care of our son. And so in that, not only did I begin to experience community in a different way. We had people who were just incredibly compassionate and surrounded us in a way, seeing me at the worst of myself, seeing me in the shadows,
Yeah.
and just coming and sitting or delivering meals or taking care of just basic needs or financial needs. I was 26. We had not
Yeah.
planned for any sort of like burial or anything like that. Um,
Of course not.
And so experiencing community in a different way really began to shift something in me, in addition to the way that I experienced God's presence in the midst of that grief. I had really seen God kind of in those years before of always trying to like be enough for him. And
Yeah.
I saw God in a way through that kind of performative lens. And in that season, I had nothing to give. I had absolutely nothing to give. And quite frankly, I was really questioning him a lot of, who are you? Why did you do this? This is not fair. I did everything right. There were so many questions swirling around inside of me. Um, and
Yeah.
to have God come near in a very, like, it's hard to put words to kind of way, just in a very, like, I knew his presence. I knew his withness in the midst of that grief, and to have him come sit beside me and just let me go and walk through that grief really shifted the way that I belonged to God as well. And so coming out of that, I began to recognize that I wanted to relate not only to God differently, but also to other people differently. I wanted to allow myself to embrace the fullness of who I am while also inviting others into that and walking alongside other people. And that was 13 years ago. So, um,
Right.
so the last 13 years has been a journey of really asking, like, what does this look like? What does this look like to live a communal life in which we live deeply with God and with other people? And out of some of that wrestling and the questions over the last 13 years, came this book. And because too, kind of this book in particular, one of the questions I really wrestled with and kind of how we start the book is, there was a woman who came to me after a women's conference, and she was like, I'm kind of doing all the things that you guys are talking about in terms of showing up and being intentional and inviting other people in, and I still don't feel like I belong. Like,
Mm.
and I didn't know what to tell her. I honestly didn't know what to tell her in that moment. And so this book is trying to give us a belonging that isn't necessarily a framework for belonging that isn't necessarily like, do these 5 things and you will get this outcome,
Mm.
but more of looking at belonging as a way of being. What does belonging look like if it stems from both embracing the deep and abundant love of God, while at the same time then extending that to the people just in our everyday lives and in the wider world as well, but especially like, you know, the people in the car line and at the grocery store and my kids, as they're putting holes into walls. Like, what does that look like?
Yes.
And so that's really the direction that I went with this book in particular, to be part of this larger conversation that I think the church is having right now about belonging.
Yeah, I really love that. And I really appreciate your transparency and sharing your story. My wife and I lost a daughter in between my son, and he was probably around the same age. It sounds like it's your son. He was a toddler. He's like
Yeah.
2 years old. And it created that was like one of the most difficult seasons. And we've been through some difficult seasons in our marriage, of course, in our life, but that was a very difficult season for us. And we had the church around us, and the church came together and loved us in a way that was hard to imagine not having
Yeah.
the church in that time. And I'm a pastor, and I was a pastor at the church that we were at when that happened. And I just remember thinking, like, you know, I'm a pastor and I have all these people coming around me because they know me and they know who I am, and it was such a public thing because we lost, Bethany. We were able to name her and everything. And it was crazy because there was nothing wrong with Bethany, in the sense of like a physical defect or anything like that. It was essentially the amniotic sac had broken, right?
Mm,
So, and at like 17 weeks,
yeah.
and so we were able to hold her, and my wife had to go through all these issues like, what's wrong with me? It's my fault. It's all this stuff, and we were all struggling. Like, I was going through my own sense of like, what sins have I committed that
Yeah.
God is punishing me about this? Or I knew that this was going to happen. Like, it was just a matter of time before the hammer would drop. This kind of like really toxic, really negative thinking that you had to combat. And I remember imagining, like, what are people that don't have the kind of support system that we have? How are they going through this? And what are they? And it just really broke my heart, honestly, thinking about people that are walking through this alone.
Right.
And it's just, I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that in terms of like, the importance of community in those times, and, the need to be connected, and how we even, like, how does, like, I guess is like, how does having this need and this way of belonging as a lifestyle,
Yeah.
what does that look like during those times when in some ways you're almost like you want people, but then you don't want people
Right.
around? I don't know if
Yeah.
that question makes sense, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything that I've said, really.
Yeah. Well, I did have that same ache. I mean, the pain was just so searing in that season.
Yes.
To the point where like the doctors had given me some like mild narcotics just to like deal with the effects of having the baby and everything. And I had to have my husband, like, I'm like, you have to get rid of these because I want to take these for the wrong reasons. I want to take these
Of
to like
course.
disappear for a little while. Um,
Absolutely.
and so the pain is just unimaginable. And I think that what I have learned and I continue to learn, and I want to say out loud, like, it is still not natural. It is still awkward and it is hard, even though I have experienced my own deep grief. But to move toward people in those seasons and
Yeah.
to say something is better than to say nothing, because that silence in that silence, we can tell ourselves all kinds of stories about
Absolutely.
why somebody isn't showing up. Um, and so, yes, people say some really wrong things sometimes, but honestly, I would still
Totally.
rather them say the wrong thing than to be silent. And even just saying, like, I don't know what to say, but I really ache with you, I hurt with you, just it helps carry just a piece of that burden, of that pain. And then I know sometimes people kind of poo poo against like the casserole train, but my goodness, like what a
No, it's
tangible
great.
way. I mean, if you look at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like everybody's got to eat. And to have that just
Yes.
already in the fridge, or even if it's not a casserole, like give somebody a gift card for DoorDash or Pizza Hut or something so
Yes.
that when they have a moment where they're like, I just can't, that they have something on hand to feel like they're loved. So, it really is just about presence. It's about showing up and kind of over the long haul too. I've had some really dear friends who 13 years later will every year on Carter's birthday will text
Yes.
me or will reach out, and that means so much. They must have a like reminder in their calendar or
Yes.
something, but that just that means so much, and it inspires me, or maybe inspires isn't the right word. It like compels me to continue to do better in that way myself, to continue to move toward the pain rather than to move away from it. Because nobody, I write in my book, like we all have wounds. Nobody gets through this life without hurts to some degree.
Yes.
Um, and so to move toward them and to allow them to actually become commonality between us, like it's really a gift. And I think it's part of our healing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That I remember feeling like for the first time, I was really afraid of God's will. I
Mm,
remember at that point in my life because, and I'm not making a claim about, God's intentionality. Did God take Bethany because, for some trying to find some cause and effect
right.
relationship in that is just, I don't think that's a good exercise. It's really kind of an exercise in futility in some ways,
Yeah.
I think. But I remember thinking like, I'm a strong believer. I've always believed in God, from the time that I was young. My dad's a pastor. I can't get rid of the believing in God. Like even like saying like when you struggled and doubted, it's like I never even doubted that God existed. And I'm not saying that's what you were doubting, but I more doubted like his care
Yeah.
and his concern for me and
Yeah.
his love for me. And I remember in that time just feeling like, yeah, God's sovereign, and the Bible talks about suffering quite a bit, and it talks about how difficult life can be and gives no promises. And so, like, I would always preach, to look for the will of God and to try to find the will of God in your life. And I really, not that I wouldn't preach that now, I still do, but it's at a much deeper level in terms of like really understanding what that means. And it took me years
Yeah.
to feel like I could not be afraid. I don't even feel like I'm really like I don't I still am afraid, if I'm honest at certain times.
Yeah.
I'm like, God, what are you gonna do? What's your will gonna mean? Like what would you say to someone right now who's in that place of like wondering, and what kind of steps would you encourage them to take, and like from your own journey, and what would you encourage them to do?
Yeah. You know, I think of it a lot in terms of even this concept of belonging, of of what it looks like to really belong to God and to
Hmm.
lean toward him and believe that we are his beloved. And part of that for me has been having some really raw and uncensored conversations with God.
Mm.
I think that the Psalms are a really good model for what it looks like to talk to God about a wide range of human emotions and human experiences, and
Yeah.
to lay them all out in front of him. And I think what I have found is that God has been really, really, it's like he just kind of holds all that with me, or like, it's like a really good counselor who's just like, keep going. He can handle it. And I know we say that, and sometimes that's really cliche, but maybe a better way for me to like visualize it is like he's like holding his hands out and he's just holding it, and like all the word,
Mm.
stew is coming out of my mouth, and he's just holding it, and he's taking it. And so for somebody who is just wrestling, whether it's with God's will, with what it means for God to be sovereign, whether they have this view of God
Mm.
that it feels like God is really harsh and God is really unkind, to talk to him about it, to continue to move toward him with that, and and just see what he does with it. Like, what does it from the inside out, to kind of let those things go out, and then invite God to kind of come in and to heal and to make those broken parts whole, and to let him hold the questions alongside of us, because sometimes there's questions like you were talking about, like
Yes.
there's going to be questions that I hold for a lifetime, I think. um but we don't have to hold them alone, is what I'm discovering. And I don't have to
Yeah.
even have, we live in a really answer driven culture, especially within
Yes,
the
we
church
do.
right now. And I feel like what I have learned in the last 13 years and continue to learn is to have more comfort with the questions.
To be able to sit with them and not have to get an answer to them.
Yeah. And even to voice them out loud to God, to my friends. Sometimes there's questions that I hold that I'm like, that cause me shame if I don't say them out loud, but I get really nervous voicing certain questions to even my closest friends. But I also find a lot of freedom in doing so on the other side, but it's not always easy to get there.
No, like that's so fascinating to me because, like, I guess what comes into my mind, just even in this conversation, thinking about these questions, because I totally agree with you. Like, getting to the place where you're willing to ask those questions in the presence of other people.
Yeah.
Just depending on how you grew up, if you grew up where questions were essentially, the same thing as doubt, and maybe it is the same thing as doubt, but then doubt is essentially the same thing as like rejection of the relationship, or a total rejection of trust, or any questioning is basically saying that, calling into question the entire relationship, depending on the kind of model that you had growing up. Questions can be very, very difficult. Why do you think that we wrestle so much with those questions, and how can, like, having this view and this lifestyle of belonging help us to ask those questions in
Yeah.
a safe way?
Yeah. I think that as we become, if we're a culture who becomes more comfortable with questions, there's humility in that. There's humility with
Mm.
saying, I know this much, but I also don't know this. like, or, or maybe I don't see the full version. Like, help me. Like, there's a camaraderie, or there's a communal nature in recognizing, like, we are human. We are not God. We don't know all. And so learning to live in that land of I don't know, um, kind of keeps us grounded. That the root of the word humble is of humus, or of the earth. And so it helps us kind of
Mm.
keep our feet planted. It helps us sink our toes down into the dirt um, a little bit more, and not being tempted to aspire to greatness in the sense of like, um, being an expert in all things and having to, because I think so often, and maybe I can only speak for myself, but I think it might be true of more people, is that so often when I want to have capital A answers about things, it really is me searching for control. It's me
Yeah.
searching for my fears to be subsided. It's me searching for something that makes me feel less like I'm just spinning and careening, out of control. And what I have found over and over again, but especially in the throes of grief, is that oftentimes faith looks like floating. Faith
Hmm.
looks like being carried even with the questions, and finding that rootedness, or finding that steadiness, maybe is a better word, by being held by God himself, in God's nearness, in his presence, and allowing that to be the thing that subsides our fears, rather than us having the right piece of information that like is the missing piece in the puzzle.
Right.
And not that asking the questions aren't bad, and if we arrive at certain conclusions, great, like that, those aren't bad either. But what might it look like for us to rest in God himself without having all the answers?
Yeah. That's really good. It's funny because this idea of belonging, we all long for it. We want to be at a place where other people fully accept us. Yeah, we all want to grow and we want to be challenged. And that can kind of feel like at times a threat to belonging. And then life brings us challenges that force us into this place of realizing our faults even you know in more clarity, and we're found like feeling, what are we going to do next? How are we going to navigate this tension of how do we navigate the tension of needing to belong, and at the same time the tension of needing to grow and needing to change?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
it does. I feel like I've repeated this quote ad nauseum. So if anyone's listened to more than one podcast with me, they're probably like, "Oh, I know what she's going to say next." But there's a quote by Parker Palmer in his book. I think it's "Let Your Life Speak," but he says, "What a long time it can take to become the person one has always been." And I
Hmm.
love that because it speaks to this specificity that I think that God creates within each of us, that we are all image bearers and we all get to have a certain reflective quality that is designed to reflect a piece of God himself, an essence of God himself. But because we are also human creatures, prone to from the beginning hiding, prone to wrapping our identity in things other than that image of God within us, that it is often a lifelong journey to continue to become that person that is always within us. And I think some of that is, we talk about spiritual formation, or I grew up in a Baptist church, and it was probably more of like the disciplines, or we've had a lot of different language for it over the
Sure.
years that continues to morph and grow, but that which God is continuing to invite us into, to become more like himself and a fuller version of who he created us to be. There's a lot of freedom there, and there is a lot of change in the process. The struggle comes when becoming more fully who we are in God, in Christ, begins to grind up against maybe places where we once fit,
Mm.
grind up against circles or churches or, book clubs, whatever it is, individual relationships that that so much of that relationship was built upon a group identity around a specific maybe value or answer or a certain way of viewing the world. And I can speak from experience that it's another type of grief. It's another type of loss when something that once fit no longer does in terms of like
Mm.
places of belonging. But I think that's why I've really been moved to viewing belonging more as a way of being rather than this place of arrival, more than this
Yeah.
like level unlocked achieved because it allows there to be flexibility. There allows us to be continued transformation. It allows for us to change our minds. Heaven forbid,
Yeah.
you know? And it becomes then a posture that still rests within the wide welcome of God, and then being people who can extend that welcome in the midst of our everyday lives. And that has just really shifted things for me, giving me room to continue to grow while at the same time feeling like I have a belonging that's sturdier these particular places or people.
Yeah, that's really good. I grew up kind of feeling like in my experience of church, I grew up kind of feeling like you belonged as long as you behaved,
Yep.
you know?
Yep.
And and hey, that sounds like a good name for like I don't know, something like a podcast episode or a book or something like that. But it's like this idea that that you're good until you do something that's not acceptable to, they say God, right? But in some sense, it feels like it's kind of not acceptable to the group that you're a part of.
Hmm.
And it felt like membership and belonging was this very slippery and very precarious thing that you had to be really careful or you were going to lose it
Yeah.
very quickly. And anyone who's felt canceled or anyone who's felt like a group has turned their backs on them or whatever has felt that and understood that, right, viscerally. And it starts to string together these beliefs, right, in your mind about who you are. I don't know if you've seen the new Inside Out, but we went and saw it as a family. It was awesome. One of the things they do is they talk about, they really illustrate well how these different experiences that we have turn into things that we say and tell about ourselves that then turn into beliefs that are these kind of like core beliefs, and these beliefs start to make up the person that we are. They did it in a really fantastic way, I thought. But what are some beliefs that you would consider like misconceptions or even common misperceptions of fitting in with a perfect place or finding a perfect people? What kind of misconceptions have you experienced and
Yeah.
maybe addressed in your book or have addressed in your talks or your thinking on this
Yeah.
issue?
You know, um, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote this book, Life Together, which is super old book. And some of it, even the language is a little archaic, but there's a portion in that book where he talks about how often we can romanticize or idealize the Christian community. He was talking about Christian community specifically. How often we can idealize that or romanticize this like vision of it that's out there, and we're always kind of seeking after that like ethereal version of it, and in the process missing the people who are like right with us, missing the people who are next door or sitting in the chair next to us or that we see every Friday at
Mm,
Trader Joe's because we go at the same time. And for me, that has been a huge shift in my belonging and helping me be less discontent, I think, with kind of always waiting around for for something that is ideal, or waiting for this like the whatever in group is in my brain, whether that's like other authors or writers or at church, of kind of waiting for that invitation to be part of the in crowd, of instead turning my attention to the people who actually are near me and to the people
It's
who
good.
I really love, who are right there. And, I was thinking too, like when you were talking about, in a part of our conversation about of us changing and no longer kind of, feeling you had to behave to belong. I love that phrase. I really do think
Yeah.
maybe that's your book. You need to write that book.
You can
Um,
take it.
but I was thinking about that, and it's really easy for us sometimes, or maybe easy for me, to say, well, that group here's how they need to change. But maybe we can make it really, really personal and ask ourselves and spend some time reflecting upon what are the things that other people can do in which I would want to shut down toward them.
Mm,
What are the values or the beliefs that I would become a less welcoming person, and spending some time with that, because I think to cultivate this view of belonging and this way of being in the world that is rooted in love, then we need to be really honest with ourselves about, in this question of us versus them, who is them within us?
yeah.
What does get us riled up or angry, or we find ourselves kind of elevating ourselves above these other people? Who are those people? you know and gosh, that can be really, really hard to look at, and
Yes.
most of us don't want to do that. But I think it's also incredibly healing. It's incredibly humbling. It's incredibly important if we're going to be people who really look for a sturdier belonging, both within ourselves, but also in the places we inhabit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the concepts that you explore in the book is this idea of people of welcome. I would love for you to kind of help us think through that concept and what happens when we see ourselves or begin to see ourselves as people of welcome in our life.
Yeah. You know, Part of this concept came from Henry Nouwen's book, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And in the book, he talks about, so often we do identify with either one son or the other, but really the story is also about the invitation to become like the Father, to become home to one another. What does it look like then to become people who are welcoming, no matter what they've done? The one son had a wild weekend in Vegas and kind of blew it all away.
Yes.
The other one was working to define his worth, which I generally relate a little bit more to that with my performing past.
Yeah.
But both sons, the father went to both of them and invited them home. And to the older performing son, he said, "Everything I have is yours. It's always been here. Come home, be reconciled to your brother." And I think that when I think this concept of becoming people of welcome, what does it look like then to be that home in the midst of our everyday lives, to become people who are filled with warmth, with compassion, with empathy, who aren't turning a blind eye necessarily to ills, but who also don't let those count as reasons why somebody is beyond love. Like, no one is beyond God's love. And so, I when I think of welcome, I just think of it. And somebody once asked me, like, could we replace love with welcome? Yeah, probably. But I think just that concept of welcome has a warming, kind of softening, a more gentle effect on me just in how I think about it. And I hope then that is how then we approach not only ourselves but other people as well. And I do want to say the one caveat is that it doesn't mean a welcome mat. It doesn't mean
Mm.
that we become people that others can just like use and abuse and trot upon. It doesn't mean that we have to be that person of welcome for everyone either. It doesn't mean we have to overextend ourselves in order to be all things to all people. But it's more so just a posture that we can have in the midst of our everyday lives and asking God to help us see other people through that lens of welcome.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, I was going to ask, like, how do you set the boundaries within being a person of welcome, which is really appealing to me, the idea of doing that. I feel like it's part of what Jesus did so well was he ate with tax collectors and he ate with sinners and he ate with prostitutes and he ate with people that the broader religious society in particular rejected, and he essentially welcomed them into the kingdom of God, which was profoundly offensive to the people that, to the religious elite of the time, and probably more than just the religious elite, to a lot of just the normal people that were influenced by the religious elite. They would have been very offended and were very offended. It's part of why he got killed, I think, and why they put him on the cross was because of the ways that he was pushing boundaries and social barriers that they had for so long, and they felt like was protecting them from the wrath of God, or maybe the wrath of Rome, or whatever, or maybe both those things like seen together. How do you set boundaries while still becoming a person that essentially in theory would have, an open table, a welcome for anyone that would be seeking some kind of belonging?
Yeah, that's a great question. Think about this a little bit in terms of like circles of belonging. So kind of like a Russian like matryoshka doll. There's uh, there's like concentric circles, or we
Mm,
get smaller and smaller the more interior you get. I think of that especially in relation to our transparency with one another.
mm,
The very center of who we are is God Himself. It is He who knows us better than we know ourselves. So I always think of Him being in that like sacred center, or you can even use like the visual image of like the temple of old, that holy of holies, right?
right.
Um, but as you kind of go outward in those concentric circles, and there's only, and those first few circles are pretty small. So there may be only room for a few people. And those are the people maybe who that we know most intimately, that we exercise transparency amidst a slew of things, no matter how hard it is. But then giving ourselves permission as we move outward in those circles to maybe have a few more people who we know and interact with, and maybe have some intentionality with, but we don't necessarily have to have this the same type of transparency that we might with those who are in the more interior spaces of our personhood. And so I think that, and then, we still have compassion on the outer circles. We still have authenticity. Because I think one of the key differentiators that I make is that, or that's been important for me to make, is that there's a difference between authenticity and transparency. You can be who
Mm,
you are without revealing everything about yourself. Those things are not like the same, and they don't compete with one another either. And so we can still, the people who are just kind of on the periphery of our lives, or who are not in our most transparent interior circles, we can still be authentic with them. We can still be compassionate with them. We can still have good dialogue and disagree with respect and dignity without feeling like we have to also appease them in some way. And so that that image for me has been really helpful in drawing some of those boundaries just in the course of my everyday life. And it's also been a practice that I've started like once or twice a year of kind of reevaluating who are those people because sometimes
Mm.
that shifts season to season, or life changes. A move, a job change might change who is in some of those circles. So it helps. It helps a little bit of a visual. It's not, it's not a prescription, but it helps to have some sort of visual and like reflective practice to kind of be able to set those relational boundaries.
No, I really like that because I mean, for a longest time, I really struggled with that difference between transparency and authenticity. And sometimes it was weird because sometimes I would be really transparent with people I hardly knew and very, very, very guarded with people that I did know and like transparent to the wrong people kind of
Right.
thing, you know, and feeling like I was being inauthentic when someone would ask me how I was doing, and I'd be like, oh, doing all right, and not just spewing everything, or feeling like, or somehow, and I think that anyone who's been like a pastor's kid or married to someone in the ministry or right, they've had this experience where it's like they find something out in a sermon and someone's like being transparent, like, and but never really talked about it in other contexts, but then did in this one context, maybe because they felt like certain conviction if they were going to talk about this, then they had to be, how could they talk about it if they didn't confess it or say it or whatever in some way. And that idea about the difference between transparency and authenticity, I think, is so key and so crucial because you're absolutely right. You can be authentic, you can be yourself without feeling like you need to overshare or, talk about everything that's going on. How have you I would love to hear what would you recommend to someone who is struggling in that? How do they know like when they're oversharing, or how do they kind of how do they define those boundaries essentially and
Yeah.
define those barriers like from your own experience and how you've kind of talked about that within the book?
Yeah. I think that experience is the key word there. I think that there's a lot of trial and error, but I think that the first the first step is just recognizing like, oh, I might overshare sometimes,
Self-awareness.
or I might be holding back too much and need to take some risks of vulnerability um in this friendship that seems to have plateaued or so I think the first step is just recognizing that maybe you just don't get it right all the time,
Right.
and then beginning to have some attentiveness to what is happening within ourselves and when we are wanting to reveal something about ourselves, like what is the motivation behind it. And some of these questions maybe are better for after the fact, because sometimes in the middle of it you just start talking, right? But I think that a lot of times for me it has just been having some compassion with myself and of recognizing, oh, you know what, I think I shared too much in this situation because that person clearly didn't really know how to hold that, and I then in the aftermath felt kind of like I'd thrown myself into the deep end of the pool and was like flailing around with no one to like support me. And so
Right.
it wasn't really compassionate to either of us in the long run.
Right.
And so recognizing that though, and instead of allowing myself to have shame about what happened, of saying, okay, what could I do differently next time? How maybe I could have been able to answer in a way that was true, but not fully transparent as I was in that moment. And then sometimes too, like I think learning to talk to, especially our friends, people who maybe we interact with a little bit more regularly, um, and this is a really vulnerable thing to do, but just asking, my sharing like made you uncomfortable, or how do you experience me in the
Mm,
midst of this, or like how, of having some dialogue about that. Because it's interesting. It's always kind of humbling and interesting when we find out how other people experience us.
yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah. So
That's really, really good.
yeah, so I don't know if that's helpful, but I think we're a culture that could always use more self-reflection. A little bit of I lean contemplative just as a human person, but so
Yeah.
maybe some of that is really personal to me, but I do think that by learning to pause and evaluate and but still go gently, um, serves us well, especially in the midst of learning how to relate to one another.
Yeah, that's really, really good. I just have two more questions. One is kind of more reflective, and the last one is just the practical one. And so, what is your hope for the book? What and kind of how do you know? How would you know? Like, what kind of story would you need to hear to know, hey, this book is accomplishing the purpose that I set out for it when I typed on the keyboard or whatever? But how I know that this has accomplished its purpose.
Yeah. I'll answer that based on how I've experienced some feedback thus far. And the two things that people have said that has felt like just a gift. It feels like God's abundance that just I could more than I could ask or imagine is when somebody says like me too. Like that I have normalized this experience of feeling out of place, of this experience of loneliness, that person feels less alone in that. Um,
Mm,
the other piece is I love it when somebody is like, I want to read this with a friend so we can talk about it. Or maybe it's a small
yeah.
group or book club or something like that, that people are wanting to have conversations, wider conversations about the things that I've talked about in the book. That right there is like a huge, I don't know, I don't say win that I don't like using that language, but like what
Sure.
like that's just a really good, like that's just good all around. And so because I see this not as like an end all be all to the topic of belonging, but I want it to expand the conversation. Like, let's get us talking about it. And so when I hear people wanting to do that, wow, it's really humbling and amazing. So,
That's really, really cool. So, how can people get the book and how can they follow you, keep up with your work?
yeah, thanks for asking. So my website, sarahewestfall.com, is kind of a hub for all the things. So you can find links to where to buy the book, my podcast, Human Together, as well as I write a Substack newsletter under the same title, Human Together, as well. And so you can I kind of think of my website as an airport, and then you can kind of depart wherever you want to go from there. But if you're just wanting to like find the book, just Google The Way of Belonging. It's on bookshop.org and Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all the places.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the program. It's really been a pleasure to have this conversation, Sarah.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Josh. It's been good to get to know you a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to our listeners and followers, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Faith Roundtable, another conversation. We look forward to seeing you guys next time. This has been Josh Burtram interviewing Sarah Westfall. Make sure you go pick up the book, The Way of Belonging, Reimagining Who We Are and How We Relate through IVP Press. Go check out her website, and we'll put links to that in the description. And until next time, guys, God bless you and take care.